10. They asked him, saying, Mark and Luke say only that they watched what our Lord would do, but Matthew states more clearly that they also attacked him by words. It is probable that some others had been previously cured on Sabbath days, and hence they take occasion to ask if he believes it to be lawful for him to do again what he had formerly done. They ought to have considered whether it was a work of God, or of man, to restore a withered hand by a mere touch, or by a single word. When God appointed the Sabbath, he did not lay down a law for himself, or impose upon himself any restraint from performing operations on the Sabbath, when he saw it to be proper, in the same manner as on other days. It was excessive folly, therefore, to call this in question, and thus to prescribe rules for God himself, and to restrain the freedom of his operations. 11. What man shall there be among you who shall have a sheep? Christ again points out what is the true way of keeping the Sabbath, and, at the same time, reproves them for slander, in bringing as a charge against him what was a universal custom. For if any man's sheep had fallen into a ditch, no person would have hindered it from being taken out, but in proportion as a man is of more value than a sheep, so much the more are we at liberty to assist him. It is plain, therefore, that if any man should relieve the necessity of brethren, he did not, in any degree, violate the rest which the Lord has enjoined. Mark and Luke take no notice of this comparison, but only state that Christ inquired, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? He who takes away the life of a man is held to be a criminal, and there is little difference between manslaughter and the conduct of him who does not concern himself about relieving a person in distress. So then Christ indirectly charges them with endeavoring, under the pretense of a holy act, to compel him to do evil, for sin is committed, as we have already said, not only by him who does anything contrary to the law, but also by him who neglects his duty. Hence also we perceive, that Christ did not always employ the same arguments in refuting this slander, for he does not reason here about his divinity as he does in the case mentioned by John, v. 18, nor was there any necessity for doing so, since the Pharisees were completely refuted by this single defense, that nothing could be more unreasonable than to pronounce a man, who imitated God, to be a transgressor of the Sabbath. Luke 6-8. But he knew their thoughts. If Matthew states the truth, they had openly declared by their language what was in their minds, and therefore Christ replies not to their secret thoughts, but to express words. But both may be true, that they spoke plainly, and yet that Christ discerned their secret thoughts, for they did not openly avow their designs, and Matthew himself tells us that their question was intended to take Christ by surprise, and, consequently, Luke means nothing more than that Christ was aware of their insidious designs, though not expressed in words. Mark 3-5. And when he had looked around upon them with indignation to convince us that this was a just and holy anger, Mark explains the reason of it to be, that he was grieved on account of the blindness of their hearts. First, then, Christ is grieved, because men who have been instructed in the law of God are so grossly blind, but as it was malice that blinded them, his grief is accompanied by indignation. This is the true moderation of zeal, to be distressed about the destruction of wicked men, and, at the same time, to be filled with wrath at their ungodliness. Again, as this passage assures us, that Christ was not free from human passions, we infer from it, that the passions themselves are not sinful, provided there be no excess. In consequence of the corruption of our nature, we do not preserve moderation, and our anger, even when it rests on proper grounds, is never free from sin. With Christ the case was different, for not only did his nature retain its original purity, but he was a perfect pattern of righteousness. We ought therefore to implore from heaven the Spirit of God to correct our excesses. Matthew 12:14. Then the Pharisees took counsel. How obstinate is the rage which drives the wicked to oppose God! Even after having been convinced, they pour out their venom more and more. It is truly monstrous and shocking, that the most distinguished teachers of the law, who are entrusted with the government of the Church, are engaged, like robbers, in contriving murder. But this must happen, Whenever the malice of men reaches such a height, that they wish to destroy everything that is opposed to their fancy, even though it may be from God. The circumstance of Christ's making his escape by flight must not be ascribed to fear, for he did not become more courageous by the lapse of time, but was endued with the same fortitude of the spirit at the time when he fled, as when, at a later period, he voluntarily presented himself to die. And this was a part of that emptying of himself which Paul mentions, Philippians 2-7, that when he could easily have protected his life by a miracle, he chose rather to submit to our weakness by taking flight. The only reason why he delayed to die was, that the seasonable time, which had been appointed by the Father, was not yet come, John 7:30, John 8:20, and yet it is manifest, that he was preserved by heavenly power rather than by flight, for it would not have been difficult for his enemies to find out the place to which he had retired, and so far was he from shrouding himself in darkness, that he carried a great company along with him, and rendered that place illustrious by his miracles. He withdrew from their presence for the sole purpose of not aggravating their rage. Mark 3-6. The Pharisees took counsel with the Herodians. Now they regarded the Herodians with the fiercest hatred, for their eagerness to be considered the guardians and protectors of public liberty made it necessary for them to make an open profession of mortal hatred to the ministers of that tyrant. And yet this aversion is counteracted by their hatred and fury against Christ, which makes them not only enter into a conspiracy with foreigners, but insinuate themselves into the good graces of those with whom, on other occasions, they would have shrunk from intercourse. While ungodliness hurries men in various directions, and drives them to different courses, it engages them, with one consent, in a contest with God. No hostilities prevent them from giving their hand to each other for opposing the truth of God. Matthew 12:16. And he threatened them. The expression used by Mark conveys, in a still more pointed manner, that he restrained the unclean spirits, who were exclaiming, "Thou art the Son of God." We have formerly explained the reason why he did not choose to have such witnesses. And yet there is no room to doubt, that divine power extorted from the devils this confession, but having made it evident that they were subject to his dominion, Christ properly rejected their testimony. But Matthew goes farther, and states, that Christ discharged them from spreading the fame of the miracles which he was performing. Not that he wished that fame to be wholly repressed, as we have pointed out on other occasions, but to allow it to strike root, that it might bring forth abundant fruit at the proper season. We know that Christ did not perform miracles for the purpose of amusement, but had a distinct object in view, which was to prove that he was the Son of God, and the appointed Redeemer of the world. But he was manifested gradually, and by regular steps, and was not revealed in his true character until the time appointed by the Father. Galatians 4:2. At the same time, it deserves our attention, that when wicked men do their utmost to extinguish the glory of God, they are so far from gaining their wish, that, on the contrary, God turns their rebellious designs in an opposite direction. Though Christ withdrew from a populous district, yet in this very concealment his glory continues to shine, and even bursts forth magnificently into its full splendor.